Hilchos Tumas Meis Perek Shisha Asar, the laws of corpse impurity, chapter 16. This chapter is a direct liftoff of the last couple of chapters, and to get into it, we have to remind ourselves of the premises that we've been operating under since chapter 12. We're talking about oihel, the idea that a corpse transmits impurity to everything under the same covering, whether it's a full structure, whether it's just a regular covering over the corpse. Typically, an oihel is what's called nevi v'chaitzitz. That means it spreads tumah to everything under it, but it blocks tumah from leaving it. Some oihels, though, are not that powerful, and while they spread tumah to everything under it, they don't block it from going above. So the entire covering becomes impure, everything above it also becomes impure. But even if you're talking about a regular oihel, which fully spreads and fully blocks, there's a way for the tumah to escape that oihel, and that is if a window is formed in the wall of the structure. The size of the window depends on what the use is for. As we saw the other day, if it's for light, it's pretty small. If it's for use, it's a tefach by a tefach. If it's a hole that was made naturally by itself, it's a little bit more than a tefach and a third. But once the criteria of the size is met, now the tumah leaves the room and will affect whatever's outside that window. Whether it's another room, tumah will spread to the next room. Even if it's just outside to the airspace, if there's a person making a tent right above that window, the person will also become impure. That was the last couple of days. Today, we're going to be talking about a different type of hole in a structure. Not a hole in the side of a wall, a window, but what's called an aruba. Aruba means a skylight. It's basically an opening in the roof of a structure that leads either to the open air or to another story. And we're going to be talking about what happens if you have a corpse or a piece of a corpse somewhere inside this structure. How does the presence of the hole above the structure affect either what's above the skylight or the next story in the case of a second story? The last couple of days have been pretty easy. This chapter is a little bit hard, just as a forewarning. A lot of detail, you got to keep track of a lot of things. I have charts and images to simplify it, but it's just important to know that we're heading into a less easy chapter in this set of laws. We're also going to have to remember some of the other principles that we've been having throughout the set of laws. For example, the idea of tuma baikas va'ila baikas v'yeredes. That if a piece of corpse, just for our discussion, it's really applicable to most tumas, but definitely in terms of a corpse. If a corpse is in a cramped space, that means there's not a tefach of airspace between it and its covering, then we ignore the covering, and the tumah goes all the way up and all the way down. We don't care about the sides, but whatever is directly in its path, upwards and downwards, becomes impure. And according to the Rambam, as becomes clear from multiple comments of the Ravid, we learn what the Rambam's opinion is. And the Rambam also writes it clearly in one or two places. This law of tumah going all the way up and all the way down also applies to tumah that is simply an open airspace. In other words, if you have a piece of corpse lying on the street, and above it is only air, there is no covering, it also goes under the category of what's called tumah ritzutza, cramped tumah, even though it's not actually cramped, it's just like it's cramped, and it has the same law of going all the way up and all the way down. That will become very important to remember as we go into this chapter. That's what we need for introduction. We're going to introduce more things as we go along as well. Halacha Aleph, the Rambam begins with a classic case of a skylight. Aruba shehi be'emtza tikras habayis. You have a skylight which is in the middle of the roof of a home. As we're going to see, this is a skylight that was not made by itself. The roof didn't cave in. A person in construction made this skylight. Bein sheyesh ba peseach tefach, bein she'ein ba peseach tefach. Right away, we can see that Rambam is throwing in a wrench over here. Typically, when it came to a window in the wall, in order to allow the tumah to go through, it had to be a minimum size of a tefach by a tefach. When it comes to a skylight, that Rambam says doesn't matter whether there is an opening of a tefach or not. If there was a source of impurity under the roof of the home. So look at this picture here. This is a cutaway of this home we just saw in the last picture. There's a piece of corpse now sitting somewhere in the home. Understand that the rest of the home, besides for what's open to the skylight, is really united under one roof. It's hard to see it there because it's not fully 3D. Especially in this picture, you're looking at a cross section, you're looking at it, from the front. But try to imagine that there's an area that's all around the skylight, covered by the roof inside the home. So the Rambam says, if the piece of corpse was under any part of the roof of this home, kineged aruba toher. While oihel, a covering, will spread the tumah to everywhere under that covering, whatever is directly opposite the skylight is not covered, and therefore it's pure. So if there's, let's say, in this home, a utensil sitting right over here, directly under the skylight, it will not be affected by the tumah which is now transferring throughout the home. Shaharehu galil la'avir. And here's the key point. Because the space under the skylight is open to the air. And so all of the tuma elements escape through that covering. Now, the rest of the home is not saved from that, because it is under a covering. But where the covering breaks, everything under that space is completely free from impurity. And that's why here it doesn't matter whether it's a tefach or not. When it's a window, you're escaping tuma to the outside, through the side, not upwards. So then you have to have a tefach size. But when it's upwards, the principle being that you're not even under a covering to begin with, we don't care if it's a tefach or not. No matter the size, you're not under the covering. If you're not under the oil, you can't become tameh through the oil. Ushar Rabbi is tameh. But the rest of the home indeed remains impure. And by the way, just for this whole chapter, whenever we say the home is pure, the home is impure, we don't mean that the actual structure becomes impure or not. The Rambam actually mentioned this already before in chapter 7, I believe. The idea being that the home is impure in this state such that anything that would be in the home would become impure. Of course, the moment you take the corpse out, the house doesn't remain inherently impure. While this piece of corpse is in here, the oil is spreading it to everywhere, and if there's utensils anywhere else in the home, it's impure besides for under the skylight. If the piece of corpse was not over here in the rest of the home, it was directly under the skylight, so taking into account that Rambam's opinion that when Tuma is open to a skylight, or just open to open air, everything on top of it is open, it's not covered. The Tuma simply ascends and descends. It doesn't spread. Says the Rambam, Kol habayis tar. All of the home is pure because the Tuma escapes directly through the skylight. It's never been covered. There is no cover to spread the Tuma anywhere. So oil doesn't go into effect. Nothing in the home is impure. As the commentaries talk about, the novelty inherent in this law is that we don't say lavud. Many times when things are less than 3 handbreadths apart from each other, we consider it attached. When it comes to the laws of sukkah, for example, as long as it's less than 3 handbreadths from the ground, the wall is considered to extend. So here too, one might have thought maybe that the skylight and the roof should just be considered swallowed up by the laws of lavud. We don't say that. The skylight is a distinct entity. The home is a distinct entity. If Tuma is under the home, it doesn't spread to the skylight area. If Tuma is under the skylight, it doesn't spread to the home area. Now let's consider a third case. Part of the impurity is under the roof, part of it is under the skylight. In the first case, it was fully under the roof, second case, fully under the skylight. What if it's half and half? So here, we're going to care about the dimensions of the skylight. In the first 2 cases, it didn't matter if it was a tefach, not a tefach, whatever laws applied, they're applied. Here, it's going to matter what the dimensions are. Before we get to the reason why for that, we'll just learn the what, see what the Rambam says, and then we'll explain the reason. Im haya ba'aruba peseach tefach. Says the Rambam, if the skylight had an opening of a tefach by a tefach, then habayis kulay tameh ukeneged kol ha'aruba tameh. Whatever is in the home is impure, and also what's opposite the skylight is also impure. Everything becomes impure. Since there's partial impurity under the roof, partial impurity under the skylight, both areas become impure. Now right away the Rabbi takes issue here. How could the whole area under the skylight become impure? The impurity is only in part of the area, and there's no covering. So whatever is under the rest of the skylight should be pure. And indeed the Kesef Mishnah says that's correct, and we should change the Rambam's text. It should say, Ukeneged kol hatuma tameh. The home is impure, and also in the skylight, whatever is corresponding to the impurity becomes impure. But the rest of the skylight indeed remains pure. Now, one thing you should keep in mind, to get the next line, is that corpse flesh can only transmit impurity if it's an olive size in volume. When this piece of corpse was lying half here, half there, was it an olive size on each side? Was it smaller than that? The commentaries say it makes no difference. In this case, when the opening of the skylight is a tefach, it doesn't matter whether the piece was a double olive size portion or not, because the law here has to do with what's called theoretical dragging. We consider the entire piece to be both under the home and under the skylight. But that's only if the skylight is a tefach. Ein ba peseach tefach. If, however, the skylight is smaller than a tefach, it doesn't have a tefach by a tefach diameter. So now we do have to examine that piece of corpse flesh. Im yesh batuma, kedei shetischalek. If in the impurity, in the corpse flesh, there's enough to divide it, v'yimatze kashir tachas hatikra, the kashir tachas ha'aruba, you'll find enough, an olive-sized portion under the roof, and an olive-sized portion under the skylight, then hakol tameh. Then same thing, both the whole home and the area in the skylight opposite the impurity are going to be impure. V'im lav, but if the piece is smaller than a double olive size, there isn't enough here and there to both have an olive size, then habayis tamei, the entirety of the home remains impure, ukeneged ha'aruba tahar, and anything opposite the skylight is pure. Meaning, as the commentaries explain, in this scenario, if somebody were to form a tent, were to put his foot, let's say, above the skylight, which is less than a tefach by a tefach, even though he happens to be covering a partial piece of impurity, but since that piece on its own is less than an olive-sized portion, it doesn't affect him, he remains pure. So let's appreciate the distinction now, just to clarify it. When the skylight is a tefach by a tefach, even if the piece that's under the skylight is less than an olive size, if somebody were to form a tent over it, or walk over that skylight, he would become impure. But once the hole is less than a tefach by a tefach, if there isn't an olive-sized portion in that area under the skylight, a person that goes over it would stay pure. What's the reason for the distinction? Says Reb Chaim Halevi al Rambam, the famous Reb Chaim on the Rambam, explains like this. He says, when you have tuma in a home, now there's a covering and it's spreading everywhere. That's called tumas oihel. Tumas oihel can only escape from the covering if the opening is a tefach. So when the opening is a tefach by a tefach, what we're basically saying is that the impurity that's in the home, even though it's part and part, but it's escaping to all areas in the home equally. Whatever has a cover, beautiful, it's blocked by the cover. Whatever doesn't have a cover, the full tumah escapes through there. So even if you only happen to be forming a tent over the part that's under the skylight, but it drags the rest of the tumah with it, it's as if the entirety of the piece of corpse is ascending through that space and makes you tameh with the tumah of oihel. But when you have a skylight less than a tefach by a tefach, oihel cannot go through a space less than a tefach by a tefach. So when the person forms the covering over that area, why is he becoming impure? Because of tumah ritzutza. Because of the idea that there's a corpse directly under you which goes directly up and directly down. So if there's enough volume in that piece that you're making a tent over, that itself is an olive-sized portion, then wonderful, it makes you tameh. But if it doesn't have an olive-sized portion, it's not going to drag anything else with it, because it's not oyel, it's another form of impurity. It's baikas v'oila, baikas v'yeredes, and only the part that's under the skylight can go up. Less than an olive-sized portion is not going to make you impure. A beautiful explanation in this distinction here. By the way, before we continue, in the Rambam we only discussed two scenarios. If the piece is big enough that it has an olive-sized portion both under the skylight and under the roof of the home, or if it doesn't. What if it's one side yes and one side not? What if there's an olive-sized portion under the skylight and not an olive-sized portion under the roof? Does it spread to the whole house? The commentaries debate this issue. Not getting into it, just wanted to bring that up. Anyway, we return now to the core case. Okay, where the tumah is not half and half, it's either here or there. And the Rambam says, Hoya ba'aruba peseach tefach. Let's consider the case where there was a tefach by a tefach opening in the skylight. V'nosan adam ragloi milamayla al ha'aruba. And comes a person and puts his foot on top of the skylight. Says the Rambam, Nasa hakoil oyel echad. By virtue of the fact that now his foot is covering the skylight, this picture is not accurate. Imagine it was a smaller skylight, big foot, it covered the whole skylight. By dint of the fact that he covered the skylight, everything now becomes one big oyhel. Ubein shehoisa hatuma tachas hatikra bilvad, oy tachas ha'aruba bilvad, and now it doesn't matter where the impurity is. Even if it was fully under the roof or fully under the skylight, hakol tamei habayis umasha keneged aruba. Everything is impure, both the home and the area that's directly under the skylight, because now the skylight is covered. Plus, the person himself who created this mixture of impurity also becomes impure because he became a covering for the impurity. Yes, he kind of became part of the larger home, but basically he became part of an oil, he became part of a covering over the impurity. But that's all if the skylight was a tefach by a tefach. However, ein ba'aruba peseach tefach, let's say the person put his foot on a skylight, but it doesn't have a tefach. So, based on what we said before, the oyhel concept cannot spread to an area less than a tefach. The hoyso hatuma tachas hatikra, if the impurity was under the rest of the roof of the home, zeshen nasan ragle milamayla tahar, the person who puts his foot on top will actually be pure. She'ein tuma yotzes le b'pachas mitefach, because the tuma cannot exit. Less than a tefach space, it will not come out. Hoyso hatuma tachas ha'aruba, but if the impurity was under the skylight, in which case you're dealing not with oyel, you're dealing with the issue of tumah ritzutza, which goes up and down. Im tuma kadma es ragle, says the Rambam, if the impurity was placed there before he put his foot up there, tameh, he's impure. Sha'arei hehil ala tuma, because he became a tent over impurity. Im ragle kadma es hatuma, but if his foot was there before the impurity was placed there, then actually tahar. He's actually pure, fascinatingly. Sha'arei ragle miktsas ha'ohel, because there was no time for the tuma to be ritzutza going up and down. Because his foot was there before the tuma came, the opening was covered before the impurity came. That means that the moment the impurity came, it was simply under an oihel. The ein tuma yotzes loi, in which case tuma cannot go out to it because it's a full oil that's fully blocking the impurity. If that was a little bit complicated, let's just look at this chart where it goes through all the cases. Okay, this column talks about where the tuma is. This talks about whether the skylight is a tefach or less than a tefach. So the first case was, if the tuma is under the roof and it's an open skylight, so it's easy. No matter tefach or not, the house is tameh, under the skylight is tar. If the tuma was under the skylight, easy, everything is tar. Obviously, of course, if you directly go above the skylight, you'll become tameh because the tuma is going up and down. But the point is, the impurity in the area of the skylight doesn't affect anything around it. What if it's half and half? So here we made a distinction. If the opening is a tefach, so the house and everything above the tuma in the skylight is impure. If it's less than a tefach, then we care also about the volume of the piece. If it's a kazayas, all of that portion under each area, skylight and the house, everything is tameh. If not, the house is tameh, but under the skylight remains tar. What if it's under the roof, but the skylight is covered? So then, if it's a tefach, everything, including the person that made the covering, is impure. Less than a tefach, everything is tameh, but the person is tar, because it doesn't go through the area of less than a tefach. What if the tumah is under the skylight, and the skylight is covered? So same thing, if it's a tefach, everything including the person is tameh. If it's less than a tefach, then in the home is impure. Whether the person is impure or not depends on whether the tumah arrived before, in which case he's impure because he made an oil over a tumah ritzutza, or later, in which case he is tar because he simply helped form an oil which the tumah cannot escape from. Halacha beis, hoya kizayis min hameis b'fi ha'irif. Let us consider the same case, okay? There's a house with an opening in the roof, and now there's a raven flying, and the raven is holding an olive-sized portion of corpse flesh. Now the commentaries say it could be any animal, not just a raven. Ravens are commonly known, even in the Tanakh, to carry meat from place to place. Story of Eliyahu Navi, the ravens brought him meat. So we use the example of a raven. The raven is holding an olive-sized portion of flesh, corpse flesh. Vehehil al gabe aruba, and the raven formed a covering over the skylight in a way ad shenimtza kazayis ba'avir aruba, to the point that there's now an olive-sized portion of flesh in the airspace of the skylight. We're going to go with one interpretation now in the commentaries. The meaning over here is, the raven stuck its head into the skylight with the impurity in its mouth, but it's the body of the raven that's making the closing of the covering. The corpse flesh is hanging lower than it in the space that used to be opposite the skylight. So the Rambam says, even though the skylight may not be a tefach of space opening, habayis tameh, the entirety of the home becomes impure. Why? Because the raven finishes the roof, so to speak. Now there's a full roof with a piece of corpse hanging down under the roof. So it's one big oil. So the tumah spreads to everywhere, both under the skylight and the home. That's how the Kesef Mishnah explains this piece of Rambam. The Sidrei Tares, another big commentator on the subject of ritual impurity, he says no. You have to translate the words vehehil al gabe aruba, not that the raven formed the tent. The piece of meat formed the tent. That means that the raven stuck the piece of meat into the area of the skylight, and the meat, not the raven, became part of the roof. So now, what happens is, we actually look at it as tumah ritzutza. There's no oihel here. This is a source of impurity which is just simply exposed to the open air, and it goes all the way up and all the way down, even if the space that it's affecting is less than a tefach. Hence, it's as though the piece of corpse flesh is lower down in the home, and since the entire skylight and the roof is covered, so the tumah spreads everywhere. The bottom line, the law is the same. The question is, what's the reasoning behind it? According to the Kesef Mishnah, it's a law of oihel here. because the raven finished the roof, so there's a corpse under the oil, so it's all one big oil. According to the Siddur Taharis, the meat itself became the roof. It affects the home in the din of Tumah Ritzutza, not Tumas oil, and then spreads to the entirety of the home through the fact that it's also an oil covering or finishing the roof. Halacha Gimel. Now we move from one story with a skylight in the roof to 2 stories. And here it gets a little bit more complex. And one big thing to remember for this whole halacha is that if impurity has a way out, it's going to take that way out. Before it spreads to the side, it will go up towards a possible exit. Just remember that. It says that Rambam bayis, you have a home, meaning a first story. Va'aruba be'emtza tikras habayis, with a skylight in middle of the roof of that first floor. Va'aliyah al gabav, second story is built on top of it. Va'aruba acheres yesh be'emtza tikras aliyah, with another skylight in middle of the roof of the second story. V'ha'arubas mechuvan zula ma'ila mizu, with the skylights directly aligned, one above the other. Says the Rambam, bein sheyesh ba'arubas peseach tefach, bein she'ein bahen peseach tefach. It doesn't matter whether the skylights have a tefach opening or not. V'tuma babayis, if there's a source of impurity somewhere in the first floor, not under the skylights, but anywhere else in the home, keneged ha'aruba is toher, v'hashar tameh. The area opposite the skylights is pure. The rest of the first floor, notice that, not the second floor, the rest of the first floor is impure. Second floor always remains pure for the reason I'm going to explain right now. The logic over here follows the same principles as in the last halacha when it was just a roof and a skylight. If it's less than a tefach, so there's no question that it's not going anywhere above that, because the tumah can't escape through a hole less than a tefach. So it's for sure not going to the second story. It's also not going to the space opposite the skylights, because that's opposite the open air, and opposite the open air is not affected by oil. So it only makes the rest of the home impure, not the area opposite the skylights. If there was a utensil over here, let's say, it wouldn't become impure. Even if the skylight opening is a tefach, in which case the tumah does escape, but the same way it escaped through this skylight, it'll escape through the next one. It's not going to spread to the second story. So therefore, only the first story around the skylight becomes impure, and everything under the skylight, along with the second story, stays pure. What if in this scenario the tumah was opposite the skylights? So same thing, the tumah goes all the way up and all the way down. Indeed, whatever's above here, let's say, might become impure if you form a tent over it. But it doesn't affect anything else around it. So the entirety of the home remains pure. By the way, you can see over here, in the cutaway section, that the same law would apply if the piece of corpse was in the top floor. It wouldn't affect the bottom floor. If it's a tefach, the tumah just escapes all the way out, doesn't go down. If it's not a tefach, then it can't get down either way. Whereas if it's between the skylights, it'll go all the way up, and everything else will remain pure. Now, this is all if the skylights were left open. But what if you covered one of the skylights? So we're first going to deal with a case where you covered the skylight with a utensil that could contract ritual impurity. It says the Rambam, Hayu ba'arubais peseach tefach. The openings were a tefach. That means that tumah can pass through them. V'hatuma bein tachas tikras habayis, bein keneged arubais. Doesn't matter where the source of impurity is, whether it's under the roof or it's under the area of the skylights. V'nasan davar shu mekabel tumah, and you placed something which could become impure. It's a utensil that's able to contract impurity. Bein lemayla me'arubas habayis, bein lemayla me'arubas ha'aliyah. Whether you placed it above the skylight in the first story or above the skylight in the second story. Says the Rambam, hakoil tameh. Everything is impure. So in this case, it's pretty easy to understand. This serves as a sealer for the cover of the second story. By default then, the first area is also considered to be under that covering, and the tumah spreads everywhere. But what if the piece is over here? So maybe only the bottom floor should become impure, granted even the area under the skylight, but why should the tumah spread to the top floor? So the Rambam immediately explains, she'ein davar tamei chaytzitz. As we've seen in the past, things that can themselves become impure cannot serve as blockers. They're spreaders, but they're not blockers. And therefore, the tumah will spread to everything under the covering, but it'll also go through it up to the second story. Now, up to the second story, fine, but it should only go directly upwards. Whenever tumah has a place that it can escape to, it will escape. Why doesn't the tumah go right out of this area above the utensil and not make the rest of the second floor impure? So here we have a principle that's called gud asik. Gud asik means that in certain cases we're allowed to theoretically raise the placement of a given object. And we imagine as though this covering is now placed above the second story. We raise it to be above here, so that it now, once the Tumas spreads through it into the second story, now it's theoretically being blocked by the good asik mechanism, and now it spreads through the entire second story. That's how most commentators explain it. Granted, it sounds very puzzling. The commentaries struggle with it a lot. They call it, some of them, a svara tmuha. It's a wondrous logic to say this, but nevertheless, that's the halacha, and in this case, everything becomes impure. Nosan davar. Says the Rambam, what if you would have placed something? She'einei mekabel tuma. It wasn't a utensil that could become impure. It's, let's say, a stone. It cannot become impure. And you put that al arubas habayis. You put it over the skylight of the first story. Habayis tamei v'ha'aliyah tahira. So then, it serves as a covering, spreading to the area under the skylight, but also a blocker. It cannot go further. And therefore, the second story is pure. If you would put this object which cannot contract impurity above the skylight of the second story, then habayis v'ha'aliyah tmeim, everything in the first story and second story become impure, but ukenegdan milamayla v'lashamayim tar. Whatever is above this piece of stone, all the way to the heavens now, is pure. Because this utensil, or this not utensil, this slab of stone, let's call it, is a good blocker. Now, the problem is that the Rambam says this could be anything. In the picture, I made it a slab of stone. But the Rambam technically implies that it could even be a utensil made out of stone. Since the kli is not mekabel tuma, the law would still be the same. Problem is, in chapter 13, the Rambam told us that a kli, a utensil that's not mekabel tuma, is not chaitzitz. It does not block. So yes, it should serve to make the entirety of the house impure, but above it should also be impure. So one of the commentators to the Mishnah, Tiferes Yisrael, he says, that's only true if the utensil itself is the covering, is the oyel for the piece of corpse, and there are no other walls. But when we're talking about a utensil being mashlim, completing a structure, then they do become part of the structure, and they do achieve a good blockage. Okay? So this is all, both of these scenarios were just if the openings were a tefach by a tefach, and you covered it whether with a utensil that was able to contract impurity or not. What if the openings were smaller? They were not a tefach by a tefach. So now it matters where the impurity is, because if it's under the skylights, technically it can still spread through an area of less than a tefach. If it's under the rest of the home, then by dint of the laws of oil, it will never spread anyways to the area above the space that's less than a tefach. So the Rambam first begins with a scenario where the piece of corpse is in the home. Smaller than a tefach, tuma's in the home, v'nasan, and you placed bein davar hamekabel tuma or bein davar she'ein hamekabel tuma. Whether you place something which could contract impurity or not, bein al arubas habayis, bein al arubas aliyah, and you placed it whether on the first story skylight or on the second story skylight, ein tamei ela habayis. Only the bottom floor is impure. She'ein tuma yetzis la'aliyah b'pachas mitefach, because tuma cannot exit to the second story in less than a tefach. In other words, these objects actually don't matter. Tumas anyway is not going through them if the impurity is under the rest of the home. But this is only if the piece of impurity was under the rest of the home. What if hoisa tuma keneged arubais? Same case, openings are smaller than a tefach, but the piece of impurity is under the skylights. So the moment you put the piece of impurity there, it's already affecting the entire line above and below it. Bekas va'ila, bekas v'yerdedes. So this whole area is being kind of ruled by the impurity. Now you come, v'nasan davar shu mekabel tuma. Afterwards, after the impurity is here, you put something which could contract impurity, bein lamayla and bein lamatan, whether on top or on bottom, covering the second story or the first story. Habayis v'ha'aliyah tmeim. Says the Rambam, what happens is now, you've sealed this covering, you've created now one big oyel. You finished the structure. So now, the tumah which has been going up and down over here is going to spread to the sides, both in the first story and in the second story. Because in the first story, because the tumah is actually there, spreading under it. In the second story, it's also, since the tumah could escape here, because it's right under the skylight, once it gets in here, it's being blocked and it spreads everywhere. Now, true, maybe, that the utensil here is not going to be chaitzitz, because it's a utensil that can contract impurity. It doesn't make a difference what's happening on top. What we care about now is that the Tumas spread to the sides and made the entirety of the home impure. By the way, it's true even if the Kli was on the first story. Because, same rule as before with Gud Asik. Even though it's on the first story, we raise it to be above the second story. And once the Tumah is allowed to spread to the second story, we consider this sealed and it spreads all over the second story, making the entire thing impure. That's Erev Esatuma. You've mixed all the impurity. Nasan davar she'ene mekabel tuma. But if you were to have placed something which could not become impure, bein lamaylan, bein lamatan, above or below, first story or second story, einoi tamei ela habayis. Only the first story is going to become impure. Now here, you have to go with the opposite logic. Because since the corpse is under the skylight, so granted, if you put the covering on top of the first story, I understand, it seals it off. But if you put it under the second story, on top of the second story, then still, the tumah should at least spread to the area that's opposite the skylight, because there's no covering on this skylight. So at least it can go up here and make this area impure. But here we have the opposite principle. That's called gud achis. Sometimes we're allowed to lower a covering and make it as if it's over here. And in this case, that's what we do. The covering up here, we're going to imagine as if it's down here, sealing off the entrance, and the impurity only can stay in here. Says the Rambam in conclusion, "V'chol elu hadinin ba'isa aruba." All these laws are only said if somebody actually makes the skylight as part of the construction. Avol tikra shenifchasa me'eleha. But if it is a roof that caved in on its own, shiura malei egrev kamesh be'arnu. The amount is not a tefach by a tefach, but rather a tefach and a third. By a tefach and a third, as we explained when it came to the laws of naturally formed openings. Now, that was a lot of laws, so let's review it with this chart. Now, maybe this chart makes it even more confusing, I'm not sure, but let's see. First, we talked about cases where none of the skylights were covered, okay? So, if the tumah is on the first floor, not under the skylights, then whether the opening was tefach or not, the first floor is impure, everything else under the skylights on the second floor is pure. If the tumah was under the skylights, so the entirety of the home is pure. Obviously, what's above the skylights, if you're going to make a tender, you're going to become tameh. But as a theme, every area of the home is pure. That's all if you didn't cover the skylights. What happens if you did? So if you did, it depends on the dimensions of the skylight and also what kind of vessel you used. So first we had the case of the tumah's on the first floor, and you covered the skylights, either one, with an empty, mekabel tumah vessel. Could contract impurity. So that I'm going to differentiate it. If it's a tefach, it goes everywhere. Whether the covering's on the second story or even on the first because of gud asik, the whole thing becomes tameh. If it's less than a tefach, it can't go past the first story. First floor is tameh, second floor is tar. Same law applies if you covered the upper skylight with a non-empty, non-mekabel tumah vessel. Same thing. Everything is tameh if it's a tefach. If not, first floor, it cannot go past it, so only it is tameh, not the second floor. If though tumah's on the first floor and you covered the lower skylight with a non-mekabel tumah vessel, so then whether it's a tefach or not, it can't go through to the second story. First floor is tameh, second floor is tar. That's all if the tumah's on the first floor. Now, what if tumah's under the skylights? So here, it's a little bit different. If you covered it with a mekabel tumah vessel, so whether it's a tefach or less than a tefach, everything is tameh. If it's tefach, everything is tameh, because it's mixing the whole entire thing, or if it's on the first story, then we say gud asik, and it also mixes the entire thing. If it's less than a tefach, still, since the tumah is under the skylights, so it goes through to the second floor, and it spreads to everywhere. If you put a non-mekabel tumah vessel, so if you put it over the upper skylight, and it's a tefach, everything is tameh. If it's less than a tefach, even though it's on the top story, we say gud achis, we bring it down, and we say first floor tameh, second floor tar. If you covered it with a non-mekabel tumah vessel, the lower skylight, then for sure, first floor is tameh and second floor is tar. Halacha dalet. Similar concept to the idea of a skylight, but it's a stuffed skylight. A person digs into the roof coating between the two stories till he made a little hole in the roof of the first story, so the leg of a bed can go inside. Don't know why, they had these beds, he wanted to make it firmly stable in the floor, so he dug a hole in the floor, and now he puts the legs into the floor. The foot of the bed is shutting the opening. So there's an opening, but it's stuffed with the foot of the bed. If there's impurity in the lower floor, and the opening has a tefach, it spreads to the second story. Because the utensil, in this case the bed, which could contract impurity, is not a blocker, as we had in the last halacha. But if it's smaller than a tefach, then the second floor is pure. It's considered to be a blocker, even though even though the foot of the bed, and some say the entire bed, is considered to be a utensil making a covering over a dead body, and therefore it itself becomes tameh, but it stops it from going to the rest of the second floor. Which causes a bit of a question, because in the last halacha we kept on saying that if a davar hamekabel tuma, if an object could receive impurity, then it's not chaytzitz. It doesn't block the tuma from going to the next floor. Commentators explain that's only in the last case where it was resting on top of the skylight. Here, where the foot is in the skylight, it's different. So it really does serve as a stronger type of blocker. While it itself becomes impure, it stops it from spreading everywhere else. That's all if you made the hole yourself. If the hole came on its own, same laws apply, but it's a bigger hole. Not a tefach, but a malay agrif, 1 1/3 tefachs. Halacha hey, another case dealing with skylights. Aruba shebeseich tikras habayis. You have a skylight inside the roof of a home. Back to a one-story structure now, it's a regular home with a skylight in the roof. Ukdeira munachas al haaretz. And there's a pot sitting on the ground, either right on the ground or at least there's less than a tefach of space between it and the ground. Umechuvenes keneged aruba. And the pot is directly aligned with the space of the skylight. She'im taleh, so that if it were to theoretically go upwards, teitze b'tzimtzum min ha'aruba, it would fit exactly through the skylight. Or as the commentaries say, at least there wouldn't be a tefach of space from the sides of the pot to the edges of the skylight. And there was a source of impurity under the pot, ritzutza beina ubein haaretz, cramped between it and the ground. There is not a tefach of space. So the key point is that the pot now is not acting as an oyel. An oyel only works if there's a height of a tefach. Here there's less than a tefach. So the pot is as though it's non-existent. So the tuma is under the pot, or the source of impurity is inside the pot, or above the pot. Above the pot means either in the open air, or, as the commentaries explain, and you can actually see it in this picture here, our pots today are all flat-walled. But in those days, the pots used to come up on an incline towards the top. So you could have a piece of corpse flesh on the outside of the top part of the pot, called on top of the pot, so to speak. Because this picture you're looking at a cutaway, or this is a cutaway of a round pot. And the pot goes upwards, so on top of it could be here. In either of these three cases, tuma baikas v'oila, baikas v'yeredes. The tuma is not affected by the pot, and therefore it just goes straight up and straight down, as typically tuma ritzutza does. Cramped tuma, open air tuma, according to the Rambam, just goes right up and right down. The ein tamei ela kenegda, the only area that's impure is directly opposite it. The habayis kulei tahar, and the entirety of the home is pure. The Ravid makes the point that in this case, by kas v'yeredes, is different than regular. Regularly it means it goes all the way down to the depths. Here, it only goes down to the floor of the home. And there's a debate in the commentaries if the Rambam holds of that, but that's just an interesting point. That definitely it goes down to the floor, not necessarily deeper. Another point to be made is that even in this case, where the tuma goes all the way up and all the way down, if there are other utensils not in the line of fire, so they're in the pot, let's say on this side or on that side, they would also become impure for a different reason, for the fact that they're touching an impure vessel. Separate point, just to know that, which is why in this picture they actually make the entire area in the pot red to show that whatever is in the pot also becomes impure. That's all if the pot is directly on the ground or less than a tefach from the ground. But once the pot is raised, let's change the variable a little bit. The pot is a tefach above the ground, so now it acts as an oyel. Now it's a good covering. A good covering means it spreads the tuma to under it, and it also blocks the tuma from going above it. Therefore, says the Rambam, the tuma tachteho etachas tikras habayis. If in this scenario there'd be a source of impurity under it, or for that matter, anywhere else under the roof of the home, habayis kulei tamei, v'tachas hakdeira tamei. The entirety of the home will become impure, as will the area under the pot become impure. Shaharehu oyel, because the pot is acting as an oyel. Avol toich hakdeira v'gaba toher. But the area inside the pot and the area above the pot will be pure. She'ein kli cheres mitame migaboy, because the rule is that a pottery utensil, a clay utensil, cannot contract impurity from its back, only from its airspace. V'harei avir hakdeira goloi la'aviroi, or la'avir. The opening of the pot, the airspace of the pot, is open to the open space, because it's directly under the skylight. So the tuma never enters the airspace of the pot, and therefore everything in it and everything on top of it will be pure. Now, This causes a bit of a conundrum because the Rambam wrote to us earlier that even when you have a utensil which is not mekabel tuma, it doesn't chaytzetz, it doesn't block the tuma from going through it. So technically speaking, if the tuma splits through the bottom of the pot, it is affecting the airspace of this keli, and then it should spread all the way upwards as well. But as the commentaries say, we have to look at it in this case as the pot becoming a tuffle, becoming secondary or subservient to the structure of the home. When it has its own identity as a keli, then yes, it could be a spreader and also not a blocker. But in this case, we're seeing it as part of the oyel of the home almost. And therefore, it loses its identity as a keli and could serve to block the tuma from the airspace and everything above it. And therefore, as the Rambam concludes, Im haya kli b'seicha oy l'mayla al gaba tahor, if there would be a utensil inside of it or anywhere above it, it would be pure. But that's all if the tuma is under the pot or anywhere else under the home. Hoisa tuma b'seicha oy al gaba, if, however, the source of impurity was inside the pot or above the pot, above meaning either again suspended in the air or on the incline of the pot's walls, then it works in the opposite way. Habayis kulei tahor, the entirety of the home will be pure, because shaharei hatuma keneged aruba bilvat, because the impurity is only opposite the skylight, and whenever tuma has a way to escape, it will escape. It will not spread to the areas past the sides of the pot. 2 points to make over here. A, the Rambam doesn't talk about the area under the pot. He just says habayis kulei tahor. What about the area under the pot? At a simple level, it's like the rest of the home. It's also pure. There are those that want to posit that it's impure. The Ravid goes even a step further. The Ravid says this Rambam doesn't make any sense. He leaves it with a tzarich iyun. It requires analysis. He says, in this case, if the tumah is inside the pot or above the pot definitely becomes impure. So if the entirety of the pot is becoming impure, the whole house should also become impure. And he leaves this as a big question on the Rambam. Nevertheless, the Rambam rules that the house is pure. Now that's all one scenario. Anyway, this is all, either way, the whole first part of this halacha was dealing with a scenario where the pot would fit directly through the skylight. The skylight wasn't much bigger than the pot's diameter. But what if what if the pot was under the skylight and the skylight was larger than the pot's diameter? Such that if the pot were to go up and leave the space of the skylight, there would be between it and the edges of the skylight a tefach of space or more. So then, even in this scenario, where the pot is a tefach raised above the ground, with a source of impurity in it, on top of it or under it, habayis tahor, the whole house will be pure. Because this will basically revert to the very first case in the chapter, where you have a classic skylight and tuma under the skylight. The tuma will escape through the skylight without ever affecting any of the areas around it. In this case, even though the pot is a tefach and it's forming an oil above it, but the oil has nowhere to go. It doesn't become part of the home, because even if you would lift it, it wouldn't fit directly in the skylight. It would be surrounded by space of a tefach where the tuma could further escape. Whenever the tuma can escape from an oil, it will escape. And therefore it doesn't affect the rest of the home. And now we turn to another case involving a pot, not inside a home, but in the doorway of a home. There's a couple of premises that we have to assume to understand this halacha. The commentaries bring them up as they explain the halacha, but just to show it in the beginning so we'll get it. We're dealing again with a pot that is on an incline. Its walls are not flat, they're kind of going inwards. The bottom of the pot, which is bigger than the top, the bottom of the pot is basically lying halfway between the inside of a doorway and the outside. That little square there represents a tefach by a tefach, which means there's a part of its bottom that's a tefach by a tefach in space that's lying under the doorway, and hence is considered to be inside the house. The rest of the pot is outside the house. Says the Rambam, the pot is sitting on the side of the threshold of the home. In a way that if it were to rise, Nimtza mimena poseach tefach lifnim min hamashkef. There would be an area of a tefach by a tefach, which would be inside the lintel, inside the doorway. Here maybe you can see it in a cutaway fashion, a little easier to understand. This is the same pot, and you can see how part of it is under the lintel. Maybe the graphics aren't exactly so exact over here, but you have to understand that this pot is under the lintel. So part of it is already under the doorway. And there was a source of impurity cramped under it, or inside the pot, or on top of the pot, again on top of the inclined walls of the pot. And as the commentaries say, we're talking about the outside side. The source of impurity, you can see it over here better, is in the outside area. It's under the part of the pot that's open to the air. It's inside the part of the pot that's open to the air. It's on top of the pot in the space that's open to the air. Says the Rambam, Tuma beikas va'ila beikas v'yerdedes. Even though, technically, part of this pot is inside the home, we ignore that part. This Tuma is open to the air. It simply splits through, upwards and downwards, and only things that are opposite it are impure. But if, let's say, this pot would be a tefach raised above the ground, and here we can see closer up, better, how there's a tefach itself of space that's already under the lintel, and the tuma is here under this space, oi babayis, or there was a source of impurity in the home, past the doorway, in the actual home. So what happens in this case, since the tefach raised above the ground, it becomes an oihel. Tachteha vehabayis tamei, the whole area under it and the entirety of the home is impure. When the tuma is here, it spreads under the pot, and therefore, since it's part of already under the lintel, into the doorway. Same when the tuma is over here. It spreads out of the house to the area under the pot. Shahakol oyel echad, because it's all one oyel. However, v'toicha v'gaba toher, in this scenario, anything inside the pot and anything above the pot will be pure. Now right here, this is how we know that we're talking about a diagonal inclined pot. Because if the pot's walls were flat, then the moment the tuma spreads under the doorway, it will enter the airspace of the pot. Once it enters the airspace of the pot, the entire pot will become impure. Therefore, we are forced to say that when the Rambam says there's the area of a tefach inside the doorway, that's the bottom of the pot. But the walls of the pot come up on an incline so that at the top, they're separate from the house. And therefore, the tuma only penetrates under, does not penetrate inside or above it. Hoysa tuma b'soicha. Oy al gabam. What if, same scenario, there's a tefach under the pot, a tefach of it is inside the doorway, and now the source of impurity is not in the home or under the pot. It's in the pot or on top of the pot. So then, habayis tamei, the house is obviously impure, because part of the pot is already entered into the home, so it spreads the tumor into the entire home. That's obvious, as the commentaries say. Because it's touching, or it's indented into the lintel by a handbreadth. V'chein, here's the novelty, v'chein tachteha tamei. The underside of the pot is also impure. Tuma does a double jump. It does a jump one into the home, and a double jump back out to the area under the pot. The tuma goes to the area under it from the home, because all is one tent. Therefore, if it wasn't touching, or it wasn't indented by a full tefach, as in this case, it's less than a tefach of space in the doorway, or it was totally to the side of the threshold, of the lintel. In other words, if you would lift it up, it would reach the side. Totally not at all under the lintel. V'tuma tachteha, and there's tuma under it. Ein tamei ala tachteha, only the space under it is impure. Aval habayis is tar, but the home is pure. Why? Because at this point, the two oils don't merge. The oil of the pot is forming, stays separate from the oil of the home. Halacha vav. Koides habayis v'ho aliyah. We're dealing with a house now in construction. The way it typically used to work was they used to layer beams as a covering for a given floor, and then they would, between the beams and on top of the beams, put this coating mixture of different types of adhesives, clay and mud and tar and pitch and all this stuff, and that would seal and create the roof or the floor in between the two stories. So here we're talking about where you only have the beams. You're not yet fully built yet. We have beams, roof beams, for the first floor and for the second floor, without the coating on them. First we begin with this case. They're directly aligned. One beam is under the second beam. The airspace between the beams is under the airspace between the beams on the top. the size of every single individual beam is at least one tefach wide. Of course, long, they're much longer than a tefach, but they're a tefach wide as well. Ubeinehen avir peseach tefach. And between them, there is an airspace of a tefach. We're going to assume for now that between them means between the beams. So every element is a tefach wide. The beams are a tefach wide, and the airspace is a tefach wide. If a source of impurity is under any of the beams, we'll call it any of the lower beams for now, okay? Any of the lower beams, tachteha bilvad tameh. Only the area under that beam is impure, because it is big enough as an oil to spread the tumah under it, but it blocks the tumah from going above it, and the airspace next to it, which is also a tefach wide, as we're assuming, the tumah will simply escape upwards, and whenever tumah can go out, it goes out, so it'll go out from this space as well, and totally leave the home. Doesn't ever affect the beam or the area under the beam next to it. If the source of impurity were to be between one of the lower beams and the upper beams, only the area between the two will become impure for the same reason. Since each beam is a tefach wide, it will block it, tumah cannot go down. Upwards, tumah will only go up to this beam and spread everywhere under that beam. Next to it is a tefach of airspace, the tumah will simply escape. If the tumah was on top of the higher beam, so it will not go further down because it's being blocked by a tefach, and everything upwards to the sky is impure. What if we have the other case now? Now it's not beam aligned to beam. Now the upper beams are aligned with the airspace between the lower beams. So if you look at it from front, you basically have a pattern: beam, 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 because the airspace is always aligned with the beam, not the beams with each other. So now, if a source of impurity is under any of the beams, tachas kulam tameh, the whole area under all the beams becomes impure. Here we have a law that's called chavot remi. Chavot remi means elevate and lower. Basically, we treat the beams as being sandwiched. The higher beams come down to the level of the lower beams, and they fit directly in the airspace between the lower beams, so they form one roof. And everything now becomes one big oil, everything under it becomes impure. But if the impurity was above one of the higher beams, then only from there and up is it impure. The Rabbi, by the way, says that the same would be true if it was on top of one of the lower beams. Because that's also, right, what happens? The higher beams come down to the level of the lower beams, so they're all considered to be one roof. So the same way anything on top of this goes straight up to the air and that's it, any tumah on top of these would also go straight up and that's it. And the Kesef Mishnah says that that's true. The Rambam also agrees with that. Now, just one point before we go further. I mentioned in the beginning of the halacha that we're translating beinehen poseach tefach as the area between them. Between the beams was a tefach wide. That's what stops the tumah from spreading because it makes it escape through the tefach. The Rabbi writes you don't have to have between them an airspace of a tefach. Even if you had less than a tefach, the law would still be the same. In this case, the tumah would not spread from one to the other. The Kesef Mishnah writes that the Rambam agrees with that, and when he says beinehen poseach tefach, he means this way. Beinehen, between the height of the beams, was a tefach wide, which the commentaries all ask on, doesn't make any sense. Obviously, you're dealing with two floors. Of course, there's more than a tefach of space between the beams. No need to say that. There are some commentaries that try to justify what the Kesef Mishnah is saying. Others say that the Ravid's claim to begin with is not accurate because if there'd be less than a tefach, then the tumah would actually spread from beam to beam in this case. And even if a tumah would be under one of the beams, it would spread to all the beams and make the entire area impure. But that's a big discussion. We'll leave that for those that want to delve into the Rambam on a deeper level. This whole first half of the halacha was dealing with the beams that were a tefach wide. What if the beams themselves were not a tefach wide? So they don't serve as a good oihel. Ein bakreides peseach tefach. If the beams do not have a width of a tefach, bein shehayu mechuvanais zu al gabe zu, ubein shehayu ha'oyeinais keneged avirat tachteinais. Doesn't matter the scenario then, whether they were aligned with each other or they were aligned with the beams, with the airspace, excuse me. Wherever the impurity is, under them, in middle, between them, or above them, tuma baikas va'oila, baikas v'yeredes. You basically treat the beams as non-existent, because whenever you have an oil less than a tefach wide, it doesn't have any power. So it's as if it's not there, and then the tumah just goes up and down. It does not transmit impurity only to what's directly above it and below it. Here the Rambam actually says it clearly. Any impurity which is not under an area of a tefach by a tefach, is basically like cramped impurity. And has the same law of going all the way up and all the way down. And now that Rambam concludes the chapter in the rest of this halacha and the next halacha with something similar to the concept of a skylight, a crack in a roof that divides a home in two. Bayis shenisdak gagoy uksala v'nasa shnei chalakim. A home whose roof and walls cracked literally became two parts. And there's a source of impurity in the outer part where the opening to the house is. Any utensils in the inner part, they're under a separate covering, they're completely pure. If the impurity was in the inner part, so now we have to look at the crack. If the width of the crack was like what's called a plumb line, right? Things that you use to measure the straightness of a wall. So if the thickness of the crack was that thick, then it's considered to be a separate oil from the outer part. Whatever utensils are on the outer part are pure. But if it's less than that, then we, from the inner perspective, we look at it as one long extension. Any utensils in the outer part are impure. What is the reason why, from the inner perspective, we care about how thick the crack is, and from the outer perspective, we don't? So we apply the rule, what's called soif tuma lotzes. Tuma will always look for the way out of the home. In the end, the source of impurity, the corpse, is going to be brought out through the door. So as long as the crack is too small, we will consider it to be an extension of the first part, and one big oil, therefore make the kelim in the outer part impure. When you're going the tumas in the outside part, we don't care about the inside part. So as long as there's a crack dividing, no matter how big it is, it doesn't make a difference. Now, notice that the Rambam in the beginning said that the roof and the walls have to crack. The Achreinim debate whether that condition of the walls also has to be cracked when going from the outside in. In other words, in the Rambam, we only see one difference between the outside in and the inside out, whether the crack has to be big enough or not. When you're going from the outside in, any size crack divides. When you're going from the inside out, the crack has to be as big as a plumb line. The question is, can we also deduce that when you're going from the outside in, you have to also have the walls cracked, or do you not need the walls cracked? In that case, only the roof. And the Achreinim debate that. Halacha Zayin, similar case, achsadra shenistika. We have what's called a portico, an area surrounded by three walls, and it's open in the fourth direction. It also gets a crack. The tuma b'tzad echad, and there's tuma on one side of the portico. Hakelim shebetzad hasheni tahirin. Whatever utensils on the second side are pure. Sharei shnei oilim zeh b'tzad zeh va'aver b'neihen, because there's literally considered two different oils, one next to another, with airspace in between. Sharei hasedek v'chala tikra, because the crack lasts along the entire roof. Nasan ragloi oikana milamayla ala sedek. What if a person placed his foot or a beam, a reed, across the crack? And as the commentaries say, it has to at least take up a tefach width. The person's foot has to be a tefach wide, this reed has to be a tefach wide. Erev esatuma. Then, by virtue of that, he mixes the tuma, he makes it into one oil, and now if there's a source of impurity here and kelim over here, it spreads to the other side. What if you put the reed down on the floor, directly opposite the space of the crack? Even if it's a bigger utensil. It does not serve. We don't look at it as what's called gud asik, right? We don't raise it and say now it's one big roof. It doesn't mix the tuma. Unless it's a height of a tefach in the area under the crack. Very much like the pot. When the pot was sitting on the ground, it didn't have a law of an oil, so it didn't bring the tuma from one side to another. Once the pot was raised by a tefach, the area under it becomes an oil and it spreads to the rest of the home. Same thing over here. If the reed will be raised one tefach, then the area under it will become an oil and it'll spread to both sides. For this reason, if a person was lying in the area opposite the crack, he could be lying right on the ground. We don't require him to be raised. By default, he will mix the tuma. A very fascinating halachic principle. We consider a person to be hollow. So the upper part of the person's body is like a covering, and under it there's a tefach of space. So that's a good oil. It mixes the tuma. V'cheinim hayu tachas hasedek, kelim, mikupalin, munachin ala aretz ze agav ze. Same thing if you had under the crack a bunch of clothing that were folded one on top of the other. V'hayu ha'elyon gavaya me'ala aretz tefach, and the highest piece of clothing was a tefach raised from the ground, even though under it is all stuff. Erev Tuma. We consider only that to be the oil, and it mixes the tuma under it. All the clothing under it are considered like clothing or utensils under an oil. Same way any pot or anything under the oil would become impure. These also become impure, and the top piece of clothing serves to mix the tuma from one part of the portico to the other.